Hello, my name is Leah and I work for Marzocco Home in the United States, specifically as their educator. And so I get to talk to home baristas all over the United States about how to make a better cup of coffee. So I'm so excited to be here for Coffee Encounters, incredible slate of programming put on by Marzocco International, and get to speak to one of the things that I get asked the most in the United States, which is how do I make the perfect shot of espresso? Well, first I want to preface what I'm about to say with perfection is subjective. What is perfect to me is probably going to be a lot different than what is perfect to you. But we're both right, because ultimately it's about personal preference. The shot that you like the best is the best shot for you, is perfect. But it's hard to know where to start and how to achieve your own version of perfection. These machines, the Marzocco home machines, are incredible. They're like the Ferraris of home espresso. The design is amazing, they're so powerful, and the ability to make cafe quality espresso is there with every machine. But sometimes it's hard to know where to start. So I want to address one way that you can get started, and there's always lots of ways. There are lots of variables or specific parts of the coffee brewing process, including the coffee itself, that can be manipulated to achieve the kind of quality that you're looking for. But I want to focus on one concept today, and that's the concept of brew ratio. So we're going to discuss brew ratio going forward in this video, and I hope that it helps explain ways that you can achieve your own perfection. And you can experiment with this. You can decide that maybe you like one brew ratio for a certain time of year and another brew ratio for a different time of year, or maybe you'll develop different brew ratios for different coffees. But ultimately, the concept of brew ratio is just a way for you to start thinking about putting your own personal spin on your espresso.
Now, you may be wondering, what is a brew ratio? Well, a brew ratio is pretty straightforward. It's just how much coffee you're using versus how much water, and about how long does that take. So a brew ratio in its simplest form is just a recipe. Just like if you were baking a cake, you would need to know how many cups of flour, how much sugar, how many eggs, and about how long to cook it, or bake it in this case. That's the same for coffee. It's much easier to achieve a consistent, delicious shot of espresso if you know how much of each ingredient you're using and about how long you need to cook it for, or in this case, how long you need to pull the shot of espresso. So that's what we're going to be discussing today, is how to create your own recipe for your coffee. Now, every recipe starts with an ingredients list, and our first ingredient in our recipe is going to be finely ground coffee. It doesn't matter if the coffee is light or dark roast. What matters is that it's properly ground for espresso. So you can use any coffee as long as you grind it finely enough to be used for espresso. To our coffee, we are going to add filtered water. So it's important to use filtered water. It's best for your espresso machine, and it's also going to make your shot of espresso taste the best that it possibly can. So don't use tap water, and be cautious about bottled water from the store. Now we're going to add our coffee and water together and end up with espresso, but an espresso of varying strength. So we could use a lot of coffee and a little bit of water, or a little bit of coffee and a lot of water, and the end result will always be espresso, but the strength or concentration of the espresso changes based on the ratio or how much of each ingredient we used. Now, we need to know how much coffee to use. And how do we assess that? Well, we need to know what basket size is in our portafilter. The basket size will give us a starting point for how much coffee to use. To determine the size of your basket, look at the side. It should have some number etched on it, 14, 17, or 21 grams. That indicates size. Now, for the purposes of this demonstration, I'm going to be using a 17-gram basket. Since I'm using a 17-gram basket, I'm going to be using 17 grams of coffee. Now, I can always go plus or minus 1 gram off of my basket size, so I could go anywhere between 16 and 18 grams, but I'm going to be doing 17 grams. But how do I determine what 17 grams is? Well, I'm going to use a scale, and I'm going to use the scale to measure how much coffee I'm putting in the basket. Visually assessing is not accurate enough. I want to use a gram scale to be able to assess how much coffee I'm putting in the portafilter. So when I'm grinding in the basket, if I'm visually assessing, I may stop it when it looks full, but my assessment may be off by 1 to 5 grams. So I want to be as precise as possible, in this case putting 17 grams in my basket. Now that I know how much coffee to use, how much water should I use? Well, it depends, and it depends based on your own personal preference and what you're looking for in your shot of espresso. Here we see the brew ratio written out. So we have coffee to water, and at the bottom you see 1:1, 1:2, 1:3, and 1:4. That just indicates how much coffee to water is being used. Now, this is where your personal preference comes into play. The flavor of a ristretto or a 1:1 is much different than the flavor of a lungo or a 1:3. And the only way to know what your personal preference is to experiment and try pulling different shots at different ratios until you determine what ratio will work best for you. Brew ratio can also be cultural. Different parts of the world have different preferred brew ratios or brew strength. If you prefer to drink intense, strong coffee, I might suggest the 1:1 ratio, or 1 part coffee to 1 part water. In this case, 17 grams of coffee to 17 grams of water produces a ristretto shot. Ristretto shots are very intense. They have a lot of body, a lot of structure, and a lot of complex bitterness. If you would prefer something that has more acidity and maybe is more in balance, it has sweetness, acidity, and bitterness all in harmony together, I would recommend trying a 1:2 ratio. In this case, 17 grams of coffee multiplied by 2 is 34 grams, which produces a normale shot. Normales are what you'll drink most often in cafes in the United States when you're being served a straight-up shot of espresso. If you prefer brewed coffee or maybe French press to espresso, I would recommend giving the 1:3 ratio a try. 17 grams of coffee, in this case multiplied by 3, is 51 grams of water. It produces a lungo shot, which will taste very much like a French press or a brewed cup of coffee. If you're an Americano drinker or just typically like a pour over, I would recommend giving this ratio a try and see what you think of it. It makes a much softer, more diluted shot of espresso. Another way to determine what brew ratio to use is to figure out how you're going to use the shot when it's finished. If you're going to drink it straight up versus put it in milk, sometimes different brew ratios will have a different effect. So a straight up shot of espresso typically tastes best with something that's a little bit more diluted, like a normale or a 1:2. But what if you're going to drink something with milk, like a cappuccino or a latte or a flat white? Well, then I'd recommend using a 1:1 or ristretto recipe. The concentrated coffee will be stronger in flavor, and when paired with the milk will dilute it, making it sweeter. All in all, delicious. Here's that shot we prepared earlier. It has 17 grams of espresso. I'm going to use this distributor to flatten the bed and prepare it for tamping. I'm going to grab my tamper and grab it like a door handle and press straight down as evenly as possible to compress the puck and get it ready for the 9 bars of pressure that'll be coming out of my Linea Mini. Okay, so let's pull this shot of espresso. Now I've determined I'm going to use a 1:2 ratio, and I already know that I have 17 grams of coffee in. So if I multiply 17 by 2, I'm going to be looking for 34 grams of espresso out. Now, the only way for me to determine how much coffee I'm getting out in grams is to use that scale again and to measure. So it's important to measure your output with a scale and try your best not to assess it visually, because the volume is not equal to mass. The volume of the shot will change as the coffee ages, typically getting less voluminous as it ages and more voluminous as it's fresher. Now, as we're watching this shot pull, you may notice on the left of the scale, there's also a timer. So I'm actually timing how long it takes for me to achieve my 1:2 brew ratio. So I did 17 grams in, 34 grams out, and that took 30 seconds, which is ideal. Thinking about our cake analogy, we need to know not just how much flour and how many eggs to use, but how long to bake it. For any brew ratio, the ideal time range is between 24 and 32 seconds. But to achieve that time range with any brew ratio, you must adjust your grind for different brew ratios. So a grind for a 1:1 is going to be much different than a grind for a 1:2. And typically, finer equals slower, coarser equals faster. So when you adjust your grind finer, it'll be slower, and when you adjust your grind coarser, it will pull faster, or you'll achieve your brew ratio in a faster amount of time. Let's revisit our brew ratios graphic from earlier, except I've included the ideal time of 24 to 32 seconds. That's what we've found tastes best with most types of coffee, pulled at 9 bars of pressure. If you're interested in learning more, I would recommend checking out the espresso extraction curve. You can Google it and find out more about how time affects flavor. The important thing to know, though, in this situation is that there is an ideal time range of 24 to 32 seconds. And to stay within that time range as you change between brew ratios, you will need to adjust your grind. Finer for less water through or a smaller brew ratio, and coarser for more water through or a bigger or longer ratio. So grind and time are an important part of our brew ratio, and something that as you're experimenting, you should keep in mind as you're trying to figure out what brew ratio makes your perfect cup of espresso.
Okay, so that's brew ratio. If I could offer one more piece of advice, it would be actually two pieces of advice. It would be to go easy on yourself. True expertise is not developed overnight. It's developed through repetition and over years. Your La Marzocco home espresso machine, a Linea Mini or a GS3, it's not going anywhere, hopefully. And you'll have a lot of opportunities to practice and more deeply understand some of the concepts that we talked about today. And two, that again, personal preference is what this is all about. Don't be afraid to pull a shot that's outside of some of these ratios that we talked about, if it's what you prefer. Don't be afraid to experiment and break the rules and inject your own personality into the coffee, and just have fun with it. So thank you so much for watching. From every member of La Marzocco USA, our branch office in the United States, I would like to say thank you for being interested in coffee and for being passionate about coffee and for sharing our interest, because I know every member of the team is so passionate about coffee, and we're so glad to get a chance to speak with you. Stick around for more Coffee Encounters content put on by La Marzocco International, and thank you so much.